So as we mentioned, we're very fortunate that we're able to work with the OON and its AON token to build out the prototype for this product. So the OON is a public infrastructure that builds on new open applications. The digital asset is called AON, so we'll be referring to the AON token. And one of the pieces that we'll come back to is that in November, I believe, Sam, the OON changed from just a proof of work consensus mechanism to a really interesting and novel combined proof of work and proof of stake alternating consensus mechanism. And as we talk about, especially some of the validation metrics, we'll talk about what did we expect to see in terms of this transition, and has it become apparent in the metrics that have been designed? The HHI is the short name for something called the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index, whose full name is rarely used because it's long. It's typically called the HHI. And so this is the HHI for block production for the OON. And we've started in January, and this goes through May 1st. And so one thing to understand here is that the exact design of the consensus mechanism Unity is that they alternate between producing a block by proof of work and producing a block by proof of stake. So it goes back and forth. And so what we've been able to do here is to compute the HHI for the proof of work chain. So if we look over the past 90 days, how concentrated has block production been for the proof of work blocks, how concentrated has block production been for the proof of stake blocks, and what if you put this together? So this purple line here is the HHI for the proof of work blocks, and you can see that it's ranged between 0.35 and 0.5. So this is quite a high number, and this is one of the reasons, and Sam will talk about this more, that the OON pursued this updated consensus mechanism, because this is quite centralized mining. If this is what we're going on by itself, there might be concerns that there aren't sufficiently many different block producers producing blocks. For proof of stake, we have an HHI that's extremely low, right? It's below 0.1. And so this shows that a number of different staking pools are producing blocks over a given period of time. There's a good distribution. And if you put them together, you get a number that's about 0.13. So this is the combined line here, this green line. And one of the things we're able to do using Flipside's huge suite of data is to introduce benchmarks. So we are able to compute these equivalent numbers for Bitcoin and Ethereum. And so you can see them here. So the HHI for Ethereum is a little less than 0.2. And for Bitcoin, it's slightly lower. And so what you can see here, which is so interesting, is that the introduction of this proof of stake has really brought the OON's level of decentralization down to benchmarks, right? If we were up here served by the purple, that's a lot of centralization. Introducing proof of stake has really sort of brought these values down to comparables, which is a great outcome. So Sam, I'd love to hear you say a little bit more about sort of what you were hoping for, and does this validate what you guys were expecting to see?
Yeah, thanks for going through it. So I think this is just an amazing graph for the perspective of, it kind of tells a story of how we've worked over the past almost year at this point around kind of our views towards consensus. And it kind of shows a theory that we had last summer, and then the actual tangible outcomes that it had on the network as we are today. So yeah, in the summer of last year, we were still running as a proof of work network, and we had launched in April of 2018, running a proof of work network. We had a unique mining algorithm that we implemented, but we faced a lot of the challenges that most minority proof of work chains face in terms of concentration and the cost of attack. So we spent the time over the summer to really dive deep into what a incremental movement in security could look like, and an incremental movement in a more decentralized block production that wouldn't be an effort that would take kind of years to build. It was really focused on what can we do now, leveraging the proof of work that we have and the benefits of proof of work, but introduce the ecosystem that we have with proof of stake and the thousands of individuals that hold AON, and start bringing them into the security model of the network. So that was the design of Unity. Unity is an alternating consensus mechanism where every second block is proof of stake. So one proof of work, one proof of stake. And I think this graph just shows kind of the outcomes of that. Was originally just as a standalone proof of work network, we had this HHI score that I think was not optimal for kind of the objectives and the vision that we had as an organization. And then the introduction of Unity, if you look at the total score, I think really now shows not only the incremental improvement that we were able to make, but starts to set a foundation by which we can now make more improvements if we wanted to bring that even lower. So I think this is kind of an important distinction when you look at kind of the broader consensus discussions that happen across many organizations. Is they're very theoretical, and that's great. And then if you can put them in practice in an incremental way, and hopefully in an agile method where you can actually put them out and test in a short period of time, and then leverage analytics like Flipside's and Prysm's dashboard here, you can actually prove the outcomes quite quickly and validate those. So I think this is just very helpful to kind of understand the outcomes of Unity. The other thing that I think, just in terms of how we plan to use this graph operationally moving forward, is really how the various actors in this market mature or change over time. So we launched Unity in November, so it's been up and running for quite a few months now, but there's just time is going to have impacts on these operators. And we have over, for example, on the proof of stake side right now, we have over 40 individual validators, but they range from very large operators that kind of run as a business model to very small niche independent operators. And time will have an impact on these individuals in terms of their cost of operations, their revenue model, how the fee market changes with competition, how the Aeon price changes. All of these things are going to have an impact on, do we see more concentration in the staking ecosystem over time, or do we potentially see incentives for it to expand? And depending on those outcomes that we can track here, we can come up with strategies. So as a team and as an organization, we could say, okay, let's come up with strategies because we're seeing an increased HHI score. Let's find ways to incentivize more smaller individual validators to participate because we're starting to get to potentially a benchmark that we find concerning. But looking at these numbers sorry, I was just going to say one more thing, that looking at these numbers in isolation is really difficult to know, okay, am I good or am I bad? And I think what's really helpful here is just seeing the comparables of benchmarks with ETH and BTC, and with Prysm and Flipside, that can become more and more. You can start having 50, 60 chains where you could actually benchmark yourself against. And that's just really powerful, so that you can actually understand how you fit in the overall landscape.
Yeah, no, it's definitely, I think this is a perfect sort of set of metrics, especially for you guys. Terry, I'd love to hear, as an investor, when we first developed this metric, I really, thought of it as sort of being in the weeds, but you've had some really, profound insights about how this is useful to you. So I'd love to hear about that.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think for starters, I think the level of decentralization that this HHI score shows for Aeon is really encouraging. And mainly that's because I think, and this is really related to our own thesis on investing in the space, but as we see it, decentralization is really the foundational property for all of these systems. And I think oftentimes people in the industry can talk about decentralization like it's an end to itself, but really it's not. It's actually, decentralization is what produces these unique properties involving trust and transparency and censorship resistance, and all these other things that we've come to value in blockchains, and that more importantly enable this brand new category of applications to exist that we're all excited about. And at least as a fund, our goal is to invest in companies that are building new categories of business using the blockchain, and decentralization is an essential part of realizing those novel properties. I think more broadly, it's also good to see that in this case, the introduction of proof of stake on Aeon has reduced consolidation and block production. I know there's a lot of fears in the space about proof of work and how that has led to consolidation on a number of blockchains, including Bitcoin and Ethereum. And it's good to see that the introduction of proof of stake is reducing that, and it's a good preliminary indication that it's working as designed. And to Sam's point earlier, I think it'll be really interesting to see how this changes over time, and particularly as staking services and pools mature. And I wonder what, if any, are the drivers of consolidation and proof of stake, and to what extent we can even measure them. So for instance, in proof of work, the drivers of consolidation are things like the centralization of hardware manufacturing in certain regions, and the concentration of miners in regions with cheaper electricity rates. But for proof of stake, maybe it'll be the DevOps requirements of running nodes, and maybe that could be a leading driver of consolidation. So it'll just be interesting to see. It's still probably too early to tell, but and another question related to that is just how can we even measure that consolidation across different staking providers and across even different cloud platforms if they're using cloud platforms, and how much can we even measure on chain?
No, I agree with you, and I think that there's sort of the platform level metrics, which in and of themselves are extremely interesting. But then, of course, when you see this, the first thing you think is, well, I want to see this for 20 more platforms, right? And I want to see aggregate industry trends of consolidation of proof of stake, and if it's occurring, what's driving it. So, I agree.
And one other thought on this super quickly is just as a larger token holder and investor in Aeon, it's really important to think about our own impact on concentration, because as we stake, we're included in this set, right? So we need to think about how we allocate our stake to different staking pools and different providers. And that's good not only for us to diversify our own risk, but is also good for the network. And so in that way, our interests are really aligned.